From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jim Flink. For more than 2 decades, A.A. Nguyen has provided the world with an inside glimpse into life in Myanmar, filing stories for the Associated Press and the country formerly known as Burma. In that time, she has covered protests, natural disasters, and the rapid push toward democracy in recent years. It certainly wasn't easy reporting in one of the most restrictive countries in the world. Nguyen was periodically threatened, questioned, and monitored by authorities, and was even labeled a traitor in the state-run media. These days, she works out of the Associated Press Bureau in Yangon and the first international news bureau since the country relaxed restrictions on journalists for the first time since 1962. Today, she's in Columbia, Missouri, where she is receiving an award for the Missouri School of Journalism, and she joins us now on Global Journalist to talk about her career, the difficulties she encountered reporting in Myanmar, and the rapid democratization that has taken place in that country over the past few years. And A.A. Nguyen, welcome to Global Journalist. So glad to have you.
Good morning, thank you.
There is so much to cover in your career, and certainly so much to talk about. Let's talk about, and maybe we should start in the year 1979, and that was important for you personally as well as professionally. Why so?
Yeah, because that's the year when I graduated, and that's the year when I have to look for a career. And that was during the socialist time, where you have to be a member of the Socialist Party to land into any government civil service. So I don't want to join a socialist party that I don't have faith in. So the only career choice was to be a reporter. And I grew up watching my father work as a reporter. And I think that's a very fascinating job, very independent, a big service to the people. So I think that's the dream of my life. I want to be a journalist. So in 1979, I asked my father, "Dad, I want to be a journalist." And he said, "Are you crazy? This is not a women's job. Look at me." He had been jailed twice at that time. By 79, he'd been jailed twice already. He said, "That's a dangerous job, and more so for a woman. You can't be a journalist." But I insisted. He said, "Okay, I'll train you anyway." Then he trained me. I really thank him for that. He trained me. I worked with him. It's more like an unpaid apprentice, which was real fun, working closely with him, really learning all the tricks from him. And that was a great time. From 79 until 1989, I've been trained. I worked with him. I hold the fort for him when he's not in town, when he's out of the country. I hold the fort for him. I filed stories for AP. Right. So that's how I got started.
Your father, and just to quickly give our listeners and our viewers a little bit of background, an iconic figure, perhaps the iconic figure of journalism in your country, worked at the Associated Press, was the face of certainly covering some of the toughest stories in a regime that was not all that interested in having any coverage like he was providing.
Yes. My father actually had 60 years of journalistic career. He started as a cub reporter and then finally became the publisher and editor of the English language newspaper called The Guardian Daily. So it started since the late 40s, before independence, when we were still under the British colonial government. He worked as a cub reporter. By 1958, he had his own newspaper called The Guardian Daily. So that The Guardian Daily became a very influential newspaper. But by 1964, the dictator came into power. And of course, they don't want capitalist, newspapers to be operating. So they nationalized this newspaper, thrown him into jail. It was a long period, 3-year sojourn. That's his second time in prison. So when he came out, he lost his job, he had nothing to do, and then he'd been offered to work for a number of international newspapers. And finally, in 1969, he decided, when AP offered him a job, he decided to join the AP. So from 1969 until 1989, he worked for the AP. And there is a family coup. I took over him, a very amicable coup.
Sure. Before we go to 1989, because I know that is a very important turn in your career, 1983. there was a story that sort of gave you the idea of what it was to be a journalist, especially in a crisis situation, the attempted assassination on South Korea's Chun DooHwan.
Yes, that's also one of the most memorable, training that I had with my father, 1983 October. That then South Korean President Chun DooHwan was visiting Burma at that time, and then he was on the way to pay tribute to the slain leaders of Myanmar's independence hero, General Aung San. He was on the way to the Martyrs' Mausoleum, but my father had the schedule of the visiting dignitaries, and when he heard this loud noise, the first thing he did was went up to the second floor of our house, because we live quite close to the Martyrs' Mausoleum, which is at the foot of the Shwedagon Pagoda, one of the Myanmar's most revered temples there. So he climbed up the stairs and he looked in the direction of the mausoleum, and he could see the dark smoke billowing from that direction. And he came down, he ran to his car, go straight to the Martyrs' Mausoleum, climb up a few stairs. And the first question he asked to the soldiers guarding the place was, has the South Korean president arrived? And then they said, no, the president has not arrived. He confirmed with other source again, just to ensure that the president hasn't actually arrived. And then he saw the smoke, he saw the damaged building. He could file a story, but he had to run back home. There were no cellular phones, no nothing, so he had to physically get back home, work on his very old, the Crete telex machine, a remnant of the Second World War. He started working on that. He filed a story, a breaking news, assassination attempt against South Korean president, but the president escaped. That became the breaking news, and AP got the scoop. It was amazing. It was exciting. I could see it's like adrenaline flowing. My father was like, he didn't care about his sleep. He didn't care about the meal. He didn't talk to us. He was just so much concentrated on work. I stayed very, very close to him. He could cover even the arrest, and the long years of his, journalistic career had made him. He had a lot of very reliable sources, and I think that was a real big asset. To be a real professional journalist, you need a good, strong connection with many sources. And by midnight, he already got information that the North Korean commandos had been arrested.
Developing sources, telling stories in the kind of environment, in the government environment, in what is a hostile environment. I don't think many of the people who are either watching the show or listening to the show can truly understand the daily stress of being in a situation where plainclothes government G-men, for all intents and purposes, are camped outside your home, where riot police might be within view at all times, where you're being watched, your every word is being watched. Can you explain what that is like and what motivates someone to power through in that constant situation?
I mean, going back to this incident in 1983, my father was working, and then I was taking care of all the phone calls because he's working, filing his stories. I took care of all the phone calls. And one evening, there's a phone call, and that this person on the other end said they wanted to speak to my father. I said, Dad, there's somebody who wants to talk to you. And he said, tell them to wait, I have to finish my story. So I told the other party that, could you please wait, my father's busy filing a story. And the other person said, with a very stern voice, he said, no, we are from the Home Ministry. And then, Dad, this is from the Home Ministry, because I know that that's trouble. So my father said, okay, then I'll answer the phone. He went straight to the phone, and then he keeps saying, yes, I'll come. And then I'm coming over to the office. Then he hung up, and I knew that there's trouble. Dad, what's wrong? The powers that be are not happy. I've been summoned to the Information Ministry for some departmental inquiry. So I said, okay, I'll hold the fort, Dad. You better go. So he had to go straight to the Information Ministry. And there was this group of people from the Information, Home Ministry, I think Foreign Ministry was there. They were sitting, and the first question they asked was, where did he get all the information? My father said that's our ethics, not to reveal the source. So my father said, if my story is wrong, let me know so that I can correct. But if my story is not wrong, then I'm not going to reveal my source. And then I think they're in a little bit of trouble because the information was not wrong. So they threatened him and said, okay, if you don't reveal the source, we hold your official accreditation card. We might revoke that. And my father said, please do what you need to, you need to do, but I have to do what I have to do. So with that warning, he came back, and I was waiting for Dad to come back, and he said, how was it, Dad? He said, not good. Then I said, what are you going to do? Well, I'll have to continue doing my stories, So it looks as though he just take it pretty quite...
cavalierly almost.
Yes.
Yeah. By 1989, you take over as the chief AP correspondent. How does that happen? You said it was a bloodless family coup, but of course,
yeah.
I'm sure he was very proud. Talk about the circumstances that led to that.
So by 1988, there was a military change of hand again. It's not a real coup, but there is a change of hand between the two generals. So my father was still with AP in 1988 September when there was a military change of hand. So I said, Dad, I still want to be a journalist. And he said, well, he seems to be a little more enthusiastic this time around. And I watched him work under, the new government for about a year. And in 1989 December, he said, yes, it's 10 years already. You are ready. So I'm moving to the Kyoto News. My father felt some affinity to Japan and the Japanese people because he studied in Japan, Fukuoka, during the war, until the war broke out. So he had some closeness to Japan and the Japanese people, and he loved working for the Kyoto News. So he said, I'm moving to Kyoto, and you can step in. And Dad told AP that he's resigning, and will they be happy to take me in? I think AP knows me. They knew that I've been working, so AP just let me work for them since then.
What a time to take over for your father. Did you have any idea of what was about to unfold with this new government, a change of name in the country, which is only the window dressing to so many changes that were beginning?
Yeah. Taking over from my father, actually, after 10 years of being taken under his wings, it's still not an easy job. I found to the fact that this is really a dangerous job, and I understand why my father was very much worried throughout, and I knew that it's not an easy job. It's not easy because the government was really watching the journalists, and I happened to be the only female journalist at that time, female working foreign correspondent at that time, and I think I'm an eyesore because I'm a little aggressive with my work. So I'm noticed quite early on, and they saw me as like very anti-military regime. I'm not really anti-military, I'm anti-authoritarianism. So, but they don't see me very positively, and I became the target of the regime since I took over from my father.
You were certainly not alone at that time. Protests in the streets are a common occurrence, and
Right.
And you're in the midst of these folks covering this story, covering the voices, trying to get that out to the world. Talk about
Yes.
that.
First thing is after I took over the AP, first thing was the coverage of the elections, the very historic elections in 1990 May, where the opposition won the landslide, but the government finally said that, they need a constitution to hand over power to the elected party. So that was when the tension started between the opposition and the government. And as a journalist, I've been following all these reports, and I have been filing the reports about, all the political incidences, and that actually is not viewed very positively by the government. And then that was followed by several protests. After 1990, there were protests. After 1995, there were again another round of student protests that I had to cover. 1996, again, I had to cover the protests. So whenever there were protests, I had to be on the spot where the protests took place. And that is where the government was very unhappy. I think they believe that a woman should stay indoors rather than being out on the streets covering those protests, until late at wee hours. So they were not happy with me covering the protests. So, of course, I've been warned.
And thus, being warned, you tried to blend in, and you would go cover some of these protests. You changed your appearance. How were you not discovered?
Actually, this is a very close call. But as a journalist, whenever I cover any, these riots and protests, the first thing I did is look for an escape route, because I know that the roads will be blocked. It will be cordoned off, and everybody will be caught in the middle. So I always look for an escape route. One particular protest that I covered, I stayed a little longer because I wanted to see how this protest ends. I know that the roads are closing in, but I was a little too stubborn. I stayed there until I had very little leeway to escape. But I managed to escape through a friend's car, and the special branch police were checking the cars and the passengers inside. So I used to have my hair down like that. So I thought, I tie up my hair and I pulled up my longi a little shorter so that it looks like a skirt. And when they look at, they look inside the car, immediately they don't recognize me with my hair, tied up very neatly. They, because it was pretty chaotic, they didn't actually recognize me at first. And then just before, a few minutes before they let the car go, somebody from like 10 feet away said, "That's A.A. Win." And he was running straight. I told the driver, drive, run. And then he just, sped off. And then finally, they knew that it's me inside the car, but they didn't catch me because I asked the driver, okay, you had to really speed off. So I escaped.
They saw you as... Did they see you as a voice of dissent, not just a voice of information to the outside world, which I'm sure they felt was not favorable to them, but did they see you as a voice of dissent?
I think that's what they see me as, the voice of dissent. And that's why they don't like me. But for me, I don't regard myself as a voice of dissent. I'm just disseminating information to the people and to the world.
The release of Aung San Suu Kyi and other developments are going on as this is all developing. And you get the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the government is trying to figure out how much to ease and how much to control, and can't quite get that balance figured out with appeasing the people who want a more democratic voice and their own need to control.
It's still true up to now. They are always on a balancing act. How much to ease and how much they can still have control. There is always this clash of conflict of interest for them too, because they know that they had to ease, because for the international community to be happy, they have to, relax most of the control they had on the people as well as on the media. And at the same time, they knew that they need to have some control. So.
As we continue our discussion, I do want to remind everyone that you can view or listen to this program anytime by downloading our podcast at globaljournalist.org. You can also find interesting articles, photos, and interviews related to our program on our website. And please do send us questions or comments at globaljournalist@kbia.org or at our Facebook page. You can also follow us on Twitter at globaljourn. And we continue our discussion with A.A. Win. As much as things have evolved, there are significant challenges that remain. Among them, what are they?
You mean at present?
At present.
Oh, I think the remaining challenge that we face now is the lack of information. In the source of information, we have to introduce some Freedom of Information Act in the country. It's really very difficult to get information in the country. The government is still very stingy to share the information. You really need a lot of patience to get a little bit of information out of the government. So that's, for a news person, is very innovating to get the information from the government. Another challenge, I think, is the government, the so-called democratic government now. They have introduced democracy in the country. and the government is making reforms in the media landscape. They have lifted the censorship. They have eased up on the internet usage. But I felt that the government is still sometimes doing very half-heartedly. They're still reluctant to totally let go of this freedom. There is this reluctance there. There's always one step forward and two steps backwards. These are the things that I'm seeing lately, and I'm not really very encouraged with these actions, and I hope things will improve by next year or 2015.
Okay. Your father recently passed, and we started this discussion about talking about him. I know he has to be proud, and we talked about that. You've come half a world to receive an honor from the United States' oldest, we say the world's oldest journalism school. What would he tell you if he were here?
He will say, "Well done."
Yeah, I know it has been difficult. Does it help you to want to carry the mantle, the family mantle, that much farther?
I think that's the most difficult part, to fit in his shoes. You know, he was such a great journalist, and my father always said that the children should be better than the parents. And I realized that I'm not even as good as my father. So I think I still have a long way to go, and I'm sure my father will be proud, but I don't think he'll be 100% pleased. I think he would still feel that I still need to be better than him. And it's not easy for me to fit in his shoes.
Elections are a little bit more than, what, a year away now. And there are signs that that may be a democratic process. You alluded to a democratic process, and you said you're a realist and a pragmatist. What do you see for the elections?
As you know, Myanmar's political scenario has been pretty fluid lately. There had been some bombing incidents, there had been sectarian violence. The government is still trying to achieve peace with the ethnic minority groups. These three issues are not just minor issues that you can, put them aside before the elections. These need to be resolved before the elections, and these could still be the stumbling blocks for the elections in 2015.
The sectarian violence also continues. Are there non-governmental solutions to some of those things? I mean, is there a way that the voice of an AP journalist, and I know that you cover these on a daily basis, to provide that perspective, can that begin the dialogue?
Actually, a lot of civil society organizations are trying to help with this sectarian violence. They're trying to find solutions, to ease this tension. But I'm still concerned about, the prospects of really achieving a peaceful solution to this sectarian violence, simply because I have my doubts about which elements are behind these violence. So you're finding a solution, but you need to know the problem first. If there is any element that is deliberately creating this sectarian violence for their own, interests, then it's a little difficult for the civil society even to find the solution. I think it is the government that should really find a strong, a good solution to solve this problem.
And just to further elaborate for our audience, can you break down the complexity of a country like Myanmar that has so many different religions and so many different sorts of folks that are mingling? Explain the sectarian violence.
Yeah, I think first I'll explain the ethnicity in the country.
Right.
Myanmar actually has about 8 major ethnic groups, and there are a lot of sub-tribes from these of these 8 major groups. And according to the government, there are about 135 ethnic tribes. So it's a very pluralistic country. And with regards to the sectarian violence, Myanmar, as you know, Buddhism is the major religion of the country, constituting about more than 80%. The rest are Hindi, Islamic, atheists, and I think the Islamic population is about 4% of the population. And the country lived very peacefully with all these religious groups. But sectarian violence between the Muslim and the Buddhist groups often are the problems we back in history, let's say in 1988, when at the peak of the protests, when there were a lot of anti-government protests in 1988, there was then again the riot between the Muslims and Buddhists broke out at the peak of the anti-government protests. Now we are seeing almost like this again, the sectarian violence out of nowhere. It erupted. Of course, when it happened in 2012, last year in June, it seemed like a spontaneous incident. But what happened afterwards, I'm a little doubtful, you know.
Well, of course, and you have the fear that this gives the government one more reason not to hold the democratic elections, to say things aren't in control, right? I mean, is that where your mind goes and your concern?
Yeah, that's actually a concern, but as far as the government is concerned, let's say the president is concerned, I felt that he is quite willing to proceed with the elections in 2015. But there could be elements who are not happy with what is happening in the country. You know, the opening up the reforms, those who would be regarded as hardliners, those who are not very happy, elements in the government, elements in the military, that are not happy with the progress or the reform that has taken so far. These could be very much have their hand in what is happening, even though we don't really have any evidence to point fingers at any group.
And you are very much still covering these stories every single day and watching the evolution of this over a lifetime that has to be regarded as nothing short of remarkable.
It is, but covering the sectarian violence was very different from covering the anti-government riots. When I covered the anti-government riots, I had more enthusiasm to do that. You know, there is more joy in covering these things. But covering the sectarian violence, there is an element of sadness in me. That why is this happening? Because these two communities have to live, you know, in harmony. If this sort of thing happened, but it's not just covering of the event. I started to worry about the future, the posterity. Where's the solution? What's the solution? Will it continue? And for me, that's not a very happy event that I like covering. I used to be very happy covering, you know, news, but covering the sectarian violence, I feel a bit sad for the country and for the people.
We are so very happy to have you here with us today, and thank you for taking the time to come halfway across the world to receive this honor, but also to share with us your many achievements in your career. And I know you are proud of this accomplishment, as you are of your career.
I'm proud of being my father's daughter.
Understandably said and well said, and thank you again. Global Journalist is produced by the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. I was joined today by journalist A.A. Nguyen. Global Journalist is directed by Travis McMillan, audio by Pat Akers. Raymond Tungakar is our executive producer. And please do join us again next week for another Global Journalist. Jim Flynn.